A journey unfolds. The early morning sun bathed Ocean View International Airport in a warm glow, casting long shadows across the bustling terminal. Travelers hurried in every direction, a mosaic of faces filled with anticipation, fatigue, and excitement. Amid the chaos, Jonathan Hay walked confidently, his towering figure and tailored navy suit cutting a striking profile against the sea of hurried commuters. Beside him, Aria, his 7-year-old daughter, skipped cheerfully, her pink backpack bobbing in rhythm with her steps. She pointed excitedly at the airplanes lined up outside the panoramic windows. "Daddy, look at that one. It's so big," Aria exclaimed, her bright brown eyes wide with wonder as she tugged at her father's hand. Jonathan's lips curved into a smile. "That's our plane, sweetheart," he replied, his voice calm and reassuring. "Ready for your big adventure in the sky." Aria nodded vigorously. "I even packed my coloring book, so I'll be super busy." Jonathan chuckled, his hand gently tussling her dark curls. He was always struck by Aria's boundless energy and optimism. It was a rare chance to travel with her, and he wanted to make the most of it despite the business obligations awaiting him. The pair made their way to the priority check-in line, drawing subtle attention from passers-by. Though Jonathan was a private man, his face was recognizable in certain circles, especially to those familiar with the airline industry. He was the CEO of Orient Airways, one of the most successful commercial airlines in the country. However, Jonathan had always valued humility over grandeur, a trait he hoped to pass on to Aria. "Good morning, Mr. Hay," the check-in attendant greeted with a professional smile. "We have your seats ready in first class, and your itinerary has been updated as requested." "Thank you," Jonathan said with a polite nod, his tone warm but firm. He handed over their passports and tickets, ensuring Aria remained close. "Daddy, can we sit next to the window?" Aria asked, craning her neck to look at the aircraft parked on the tarmac. "I made sure of that," Jonathan assured her, kneeling briefly to straighten the bow on her yellow dress. "You'll have the best view of the clouds." As they proceeded through security, Jonathan felt a twinge of guilt. Aria was too young to understand the weight of his responsibilities. This trip, though thrilling for her, was a necessity for him, a last-minute investor meeting that demanded his attention. His position as CEO often required sacrifices, and today would be no different. "Daddy, what's the first thing you're going to do on the plane?" Aria asked as they waited to board. Jonathan smiled at her inquisitiveness. "Make sure you're all settled in and comfortable. After that, I'll head back to take care of some work." "Okay," Aria said, her voice tinged with understanding beyond her years. "I'll be good. Pinky promise." She held up her tiny pinky finger, and Jonathan linked it with his own, sealing their unspoken bond. Once aboard, the captain greeted them warmly at the door. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Hay. It's an honor to have you flying with us today." "Thank you, Captain," Jonathan replied, shaking the man's hand. "This is my daughter, Aria." The captain crouched slightly to Aria's level, offering her a kind smile. "Are you excited to fly today, young lady?" "Yes," Aria beamed. "Daddy says I get to see the clouds." "That's right," the captain said with a chuckle. "And I promise to get you there safely." As they made their way to the first-class cabin, a flight attendant named Grace intercepted them. She was tall, with sharp features and an air of efficiency that bordered on aloofness. Her eyes flicked briefly to Aria before settling on Jonathan. "Good morning, Mr. Hay," Grace said with a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard. Your seat is ready." Jonathan noted the stiffness in her demeanor but dismissed it, focusing instead on helping Aria settle into her plush window seat. He knelt beside her, explaining how to adjust the seatbelt and use the in-flight entertainment system. "I'll be in the other cabin for a little while, but I'll come back to check on you," Jonathan reassured her. "If you need anything, just ask Miss Grace here. She'll take good care of you." Grace nodded, her expression unreadable. "Of course, Mr. Hay. We'll ensure she's comfortable." Satisfied, Jonathan kissed Aria on the forehead and stood to leave. "Be good, sweetheart," he said, his voice soft with affection. "I will, Daddy. Pinky promise, remember," Aria replied, her face radiant with a smile. Jonathan chuckled, gave her one last look, and headed toward the economy cabin. Grace watched him leave, her smile fading as she turned back to Aria. The little girl was already engrossed in arranging her crayons and coloring book on the fold-out tray. Grace sighed inwardly, suppressing the flicker of irritation that had been building since the morning briefing. Babysitting wasn't part of her job description, and catering to the CEO's child felt like an unnecessary imposition. "Let me know if you need anything," she said curtly, her tone lacking warmth. Aria looked up, her innocent eyes full of trust. "Okay, Miss Grace," she replied cheerfully. Grace turned on her heel, her thoughts clouded with annoyance. It was going to be a long flight. As the plane taxied down the runway, Aria pressed her nose against the window, marveling at the massive engines roaring to life. The thrill of takeoff made her giggle with excitement, a sound that carried lightly through the cabin. Meanwhile, in the economy section, Jonathan settled into his seat, his mind already shifting to the agenda for the meeting. Though he had entrusted Aria to the care of the flight attendants, he couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. She was his world, and leaving her alone, even in first class, tugged at his protective instincts. The plane ascended smoothly, the seatbelt sign flickering off. Passengers around Jonathan began to relax, some pulling out laptops while others ordered beverages. He glanced at his watch, mentally calculating how long it would be before he could return to check on Aria. Unbeknownst to him, in the first-class cabin, a subtle tension had begun to brew. Grace, feeling the weight of her own frustrations, was about to make choices that would set the course of an unforgettable journey. For everyone on board. Clouds and conflicts. The plane soared gracefully above the clouds, the hum of the engines providing a constant backdrop to the activities within the cabin. Aria sat in her first-class seat, her small fingers meticulously coloring the pages of her book. She'd chosen bright yellows and pinks for her drawing. A cheerful sun surrounded by fluffy clouds, a reflection of her excitement to be in the sky. Grace, the flight attendant assigned to first class, moved efficiently through her duties. Her steps were brisk, her smiles reserved, and her interactions with passengers polite but perfunctory. She had a reputation for professionalism, but today she was feeling the strain. The CEO's daughter, sitting quietly yet undeniably present, reminded her of responsibilities she hadn't anticipated. As Grace passed Aria's seat, she noticed the girl's crayons scattered on the tray table. Without stopping, she muttered, "Please keep your area tidy. This isn't a playroom." Aria looked up, startled. "Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Grace. I'll clean it up," she said quickly, her small hands gathering the crayons into a neat pile. Grace nodded curtly and moved on. It wasn't that Aria had done anything particularly wrong. It was the principle. Grace had always believed that first class was a sanctuary for adults who paid a premium for peace, not a place for children, even if they happened to be related to the CEO. A few rows back, an elderly woman caught Grace's arm gently. "Excuse me, dear. Could I trouble you for a cup of tea?" "Of course, ma'am," Grace replied, her professional mask slipping back into place. She fetched the tea promptly, her mind wandering as she worked. She thought about the extra shifts she'd taken on lately, the mounting bills waiting for her at home, and the career ambitions she feared might slip through her fingers. Babysitting a child, no matter how quiet, felt like one more unfair burden. Back at Aria's seat, the little girl had finished her drawing and was now staring out the window, marveling at the endless expanse of white clouds. She leaned slightly over the tray table to get a better view, her cheek pressing against the cold glass. Her imagination ran wild as she tried to spot shapes in the billowing formations. A dragon here, a castle there. She was so engrossed in her cloud watching that she didn't notice when her juice box tipped over, spilling a small puddle of orange liquid onto the tray. Aria gasped and quickly grabbed a napkin to clean up the mess, her small hands moving frantically. Grace arrived at that moment, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. She sighed audibly, crossing her arms. What happened here? I spilled my juice, Aria admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm cleaning it up. Grace frowned, her irritation bubbling to the surface. This is why children shouldn't be left alone in first class, she muttered, though loud enough for Aria to hear. The comment stung, but Aria kept her head down, focusing on wiping the table clean. I'm sorry, she said softly. Grace didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed the tray and napkins, disposing of them with a huff. As she walked away, a few passengers exchanged uneasy glances. While Aria hadn't caused much disruption, the tension in Grace's voice was palpable. One of the passengers, a middle-aged man in a crisp business suit, leaned toward Aria with a kind smile. Don't worry, little one, he said quietly. Accidents happen. Aria managed a small smile in return, but her excitement from earlier had dimmed. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, Jonathan Hay checked his watch again. He had been trying to focus on the reports and presentations he needed to review, but his thoughts kept drifting to Aria. He knew she was a responsible child, but the decision to leave her alone still weighed heavily on him. Unable to resist, Jonathan flagged down a flight attendant. Excuse me, could you let the first-class crew know I'd like to check on my daughter? Of course, Mr. Hay, the attendant replied, her tone respectful. She disappeared toward the front of the plane, leaving Jonathan to gather his belongings in preparation for the short visit. Back in first class, Aria had resumed her coloring. Though her strokes were less confident, her colors less vibrant. She missed her father's reassuring presence and was beginning to feel the weight of being alone in an unfamiliar space. Grace, meanwhile, had returned to serving drinks and snacks, her movements precise but lacking warmth. As she approached Aria's row again, she noticed the girl flipping through the in-flight entertainment options. Is everything working properly? Grace asked, her tone clipped. Yes, thank you, Aria replied, trying her best to sound cheerful. Grace nodded and moved on, but her demeanor left Aria feeling small. She wished her father would come back soon. When Jonathan finally arrived in first class, Aria's face lit up like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Daddy, she exclaimed, jumping out of her seat to hug him. Jonathan knelt to her level, wrapping her in a warm embrace. How's my favorite traveler doing? I'm okay, Aria said, her voice steady but lacking its usual exuberance. I spilled my juice earlier, but I cleaned it up. Jonathan's brows furrowed slightly. Did anyone help you? Miss Grace cleaned the rest, Aria said hesitantly. Jonathan glanced around, his gaze settling briefly on Grace, who was busy attending to another passenger. He sensed a hint of discomfort in Aria's tone, but chose not to press the issue just yet. Do you need anything? More snacks? Another juice? He asked, his voice gentle. Aria shook her head. I'm okay, Daddy. Can you stay a little longer? Jonathan's heart ached at the request. I wish I could, sweetheart, but I have to finish some work. I'll come back soon, though. Promise. Pinky promise, he said, holding out his finger. Aria smiled and linked hers with his, the simple gesture restoring a bit of her confidence. As Jonathan stood to leave, he caught Grace's eye. Her expression was neutral, but he detected a subtle stiffness in her posture. For now, he let it go, deciding to address any concerns later. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in first class grew more strained. Grace's growing impatience with Aria, subtle but noticeable, began to irk other passengers. The murmurs of discontent spread like ripples in a pond. And all the while, Aria did her best to stay out of trouble, unaware of the storm brewing around her. The weight of prejudice, the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, a rhythmic reminder of the distance growing between Aria and the world she knew below. Seated by the window in first class, she gazed outside at the endless expanse of clouds, tracing imaginary patterns with her finger against the cool glass. The excitement she had felt at the beginning of the flight had now been replaced by something quieter, something that made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. Grace moved through the aisle with her usual poise, offering drinks and attending to the first-class passengers with well-practiced efficiency. However, her demeanor hardened slightly whenever her gaze fell upon Aria. The flight attendant's patience had already been tested earlier with the spilled juice, and now, as Aria fidgeted with her tray table, Grace's irritation bubbled beneath the surface. "Miss Grace," Aria's small voice broke the quiet hum of the cabin. Grace turned with a forced smile. "Yes. Could I please have a blanket? I'm feeling a little cold," Aria asked politely, remembering the manners her father had taught her. Grace pursed her lips. "Blankets are available for business-class passengers first," she said, her tone clipped. "I'll see if there's one left after I finish my rounds." Aria nodded, her fingers gripping the edge of her dress. "Thank you." As Grace turned away, a woman seated across the aisle frowned slightly. "That little girl is a paying passenger too, isn't she?" the woman said, adjusting her reading glasses. Grace stiffened but offered a tight-lipped response. "Of course, ma'am." Still, minutes passed without a blanket arriving, and Aria, sensing Grace's disapproval, didn't dare ask again. She curled up in her seat, pulling her arms around herself in an attempt to stay warm. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, Jonathan Hay reviewed financial projections on his tablet, but his mind kept wandering to Aria. A gnawing feeling of unease wouldn't leave him, and though he trusted the crew to take care of her, he couldn't shake the worry that something wasn't quite right. He set the tablet down and glanced at the time. It had been nearly an hour since he last checked on Aria, and his instincts urged him to go back. Flagging down another flight attendant, he asked, "Is everything all right in first class with my daughter?" The attendant, a younger woman with a warm demeanor, smiled. "I believe so, Mr. Hay. Would you like me to check for you?" Jonathan considered it, then shook his head. "No, I'll go myself." Rising from his seat, he made his way toward the first-class cabin, nodding politely to passengers as he passed. The flight attendants in economy noticed his departure, and a quiet murmur followed in his wake. Some recognized him. Others only saw a well-dressed man with an air of authority. As Jonathan stepped into the plush, quieter atmosphere of first class, he immediately spotted Aria's small figure curled up in her seat. Her coloring book lay forgotten on the tray table, and her eyes looked heavy with drowsiness. "Aria." Jonathan's voice was gentle but concerned. Her eyes fluttered open, and she smiled sleepily. "Hi, Daddy." Jonathan knelt beside her. "Are you okay? Sweetheart, you look tired." Aria hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm okay. Just a little cold." Jonathan's gaze flicked to the flight attendant station where Grace stood, folding napkins with precise movements. He straightened and walked over, his voice polite but firm. "Excuse me, Miss Grace. My daughter mentioned she's cold. May I have a blanket for her?" Grace blinked, momentarily caught off guard by his presence. She quickly masked her surprise with a professional smile. "Of course, Mr. Hay. I apologize for the delay." With forced efficiency, she retrieved a neatly folded blanket and handed it over. Jonathan accepted it without another word, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. There was something in her gaze, a flicker of unease. Returning to Aria, Jonathan tucked the blanket around her. "Better?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Aria nodded. "Thank you, Daddy." Jonathan lingered for a moment, his instincts telling him something was amiss. He noticed how Aria avoided looking at Grace, and how some of the nearby passengers sent him subtle glances of understanding. Sensing the undercurrents of the situation, Jonathan gave Aria a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "I'll be back soon, okay? If you need anything, just press the call button." "I will," Aria promised, her smile small but genuine. As Jonathan walked back toward the economy cabin, his expression darkened. Years in business had taught him to read people, and what he had seen in Grace's demeanor left him with lingering doubts. Grace exhaled as Jonathan disappeared behind the curtain separating the cabins. Her heart pounded slightly. She had known who he was from the moment he boarded, but she hadn't expected him to come back so soon. More than anything, she didn't expect the subtle yet powerful presence he carried, the kind that made her feel like she was under a microscope. She turned back to Aria, who was now snug under the blanket. "Are you comfortable now?" Aria nodded timidly, not wanting to cause more trouble. Grace forced a smile and walked away, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a mistake in handling the little girl the way she did. As the flight continued, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Aria remained in her seat, trying her best to be the perfect little passenger, but the weight of Grace's earlier remarks hung over her like a cloud. Passengers seated nearby exchanged quiet murmurs, their observations of the subtle mistreatment stirring empathy for the little girl. A man in a business suit leaned toward his colleague. "You'd think the staff would be more accommodating to a child, especially one so well-behaved." His colleague nodded. Some people let their prejudices show in the smallest ways. Grace, overhearing the whispered comments, clenched her jaw. She knew she was being watched, and the weight of her earlier behavior pressed on her. Back in economy, Jonathan sat deep in thought. He drummed his fingers lightly on the armrest, his mind racing through various possibilities. He had built Orion Airways with the values of integrity, excellence, and respect, values that he held dear. And yet, here he was, sensing that his own daughter was experiencing something far from that ideal. With a deep breath, he made a mental note to observe carefully for the remainder of the flight. What Grace didn't realize was that she was under scrutiny by the very man who could decide the future of her career with a single decision. And soon, a moment would come that would push everything to the tipping point. Cracks in the facade. The steady hum of the engines vibrated softly through the plush first-class cabin, a constant reminder of the miles ticking away beneath them. Aria sat quietly in her oversized seat, wrapped snugly in the blanket her father had brought. Her eyes, wide and observant, flickered across the faces of other passengers, most of whom seemed preoccupied with their own affairs, reading, working on laptops, or simply gazing out the windows lost in thought. Grace, the lead flight attendant, moved through the cabin with mechanical precision, her every action calculated and efficient. Her smile, though still present, was beginning to feel strained. The presence of Aria continued to gnaw at her. It wasn't that Aria had done anything wrong. She was, by all accounts, a polite and well-behaved child. But Grace couldn't help the irritation simmering beneath her professional exterior. She had worked hard to earn her place in first class, serving executives, celebrities, and dignitaries. It was a far cry from the crowded economy cabins where she had started, and she wasn't about to let a child disturb the delicate balance of her domain. Across the aisle, a distinguished older woman named Mrs. Lancaster observed the interactions between Grace and Aria with a critical eye. Mrs. Lancaster was no stranger to privilege. She had traveled the world over in luxury, and she had seen all manner of people in her years. Something about Grace's demeanor troubled her, and she watched with increasing unease as the flight attendant made Aria feel smaller with each passing interaction. Aria, sensing the tension, did her best to stay out of the way. She focused on her coloring book, occasionally glancing up as Grace passed by, hoping to avoid another scolding. Her father's reassuring words echoed in her mind. Just press the call button if you need anything. But she didn't want to cause trouble. Not for herself, and especially not for Daddy. Jonathan sat in the economy cabin, his thoughts still clouded with unease. He tapped his pen lightly against the leather-bound notebook in his lap, jotting down a few notes on the upcoming investor meeting, but unable to concentrate fully. His gut told him something was off. He had built Orion Airways on the foundation of excellence, priding himself on hiring employees who embodied the values of respect, integrity, and care for every passenger. Yet something about Grace's demeanor didn't sit right with him. It wasn't what she said. It was the way she said it, the dismissiveness in her tone when she addressed Aria. Unable to shake his concerns, he flagged down a passing flight attendant. "Excuse me," he said with a polite smile. "Would you mind checking in on my daughter? I just want to make sure she's comfortable." The flight attendant, a young woman with kind eyes named Emily, nodded immediately. "Of course, Mr. Hay. I'll check on her right away." Jonathan watched as Emily disappeared toward the first-class cabin, his fingers tightening around the notebook. In first class, Grace was clearing away empty glasses when Emily arrived, her presence a stark contrast to Grace's frosty professionalism. Emily approached Aria with a warm smile. "Hi there, sweetie," she said softly, kneeling beside Aria's seat. "Your dad just wanted me to check in and see if you're doing okay." Aria brightened slightly at the kindness in Emily's voice. "I'm okay," she said, fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "It's just, I think Miss Grace doesn't like me very much." Emily's heart twisted at the quiet confession. She glanced toward Grace, who stood stiffly at the front of the cabin, pretending not to hear. "I'm sure she's just busy," Emily said diplomatically, offering Aria a reassuring squeeze of the hand. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask, okay?" Aria nodded, comforted by Emily's presence. Grace, overhearing the exchange, felt a prick of irritation. As Emily stood to leave, Grace intercepted her with a cold smile. "Is there a problem?" Emily, ever the professional, kept her expression neutral. "Just checking in on the CEO's daughter, per his request." Grace's eyes darkened for the briefest moment. "I have it under control," she said through gritted teeth. Emily held Grace's gaze for a moment before offering a curt nod and walking away. The tension hung thick in the air. A few rows away, Mrs. Lancaster took in the entire exchange with an expression of growing disapproval. She had seen enough. Pressing the call button, she waited patiently until Grace approached with her polished, impersonal smile. "Yes, Mrs. Lancaster." The older woman folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Young lady, I have traveled more flights than I can count, and I pride myself on observing people quite well." She glanced meaningfully at Aria. "I have noticed that you seem, shall we say, less than accommodating toward that young girl." Grace stiffened. "I assure you, Mrs. Lancaster, I treat all passengers equally." "Do you now?" Mrs. Lancaster raised an elegant eyebrow. "Because it seems to me you're treating her with less patience than you would an adult in her seat." Grace swallowed, feeling the weight of Mrs. Lancaster's stare. "I'm sorry if it appeared that way, ma'am," she said tersely, then turned sharply and walked away. Jonathan, sensing something had shifted, returned to first class a short while later. As he entered, he saw the tension written on Grace's face, the lingering displeasure on Mrs. Lancaster's, and the way Aria's smile grew wider at his approach. "Hi, sweetheart," he said, crouching down next to her seat. "Everything okay?" Aria hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Emily was really nice," she said softly, casting a quick glance at Grace, who was watching from a distance. Jonathan's gaze followed Aria's, and in that moment, the picture became clear. His eyes hardened just slightly, though his voice remained warm. "Good. I'm glad to hear that." Standing up, Jonathan's sharp gaze locked onto Grace's. "Miss Grace, a moment." She walked over, her posture rigid. "Yes, Mr. Hay." Jonathan's expression was calm but firm. "I believe my daughter may not be feeling as welcome as I'd hoped." Grace's mouth opened slightly, her carefully constructed professional mask cracking. "Mr. Hay, Jonathan held up a hand. "I expect every passenger on this plane to be treated with the same respect and care, regardless of their age." His voice remained low, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "Is that understood?" Grace swallowed hard, her cheeks flushing. "Yes, Mr. Hay. I apologize if—" Jonathan's eyes didn't waver. "Apologies are best shown, not spoken." With that, he turned back to Aria, placing a gentle hand on her head before returning to his seat in economy. Grace stood frozen for a moment, the reality of who she had been dismissing sinking in. The CEO of Orion Airways wasn't just any passenger, he was the passenger, and her actions had not gone unnoticed. As the flight continued, Aria finally began to feel at ease, knowing her father was always watching over her. And as for Grace, she would spend the remainder of the flight under the scrutinizing eyes of passengers who now knew exactly who she had underestimated. The breaking point. The luxurious first-class cabin, once a haven of quiet elegance, now buzzed with a subtle but undeniable tension. Aria sat curled in her seat, the warmth of the blanket her father had brought offering little comfort against the discomfort that lingered in her chest. She had done everything right, used her inside voice, kept her seatbelt on, and even politely thanked the flight attendants. But Grace's cold stares and clipped responses made her feel like she didn't belong. Across the aisle, Mrs. Lancaster watched Grace with a discerning gaze, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. A woman of her stature had seen many things in her years, but there was something particularly distasteful about witnessing an innocent child being treated with such indifference. She tapped her manicured fingers lightly on the armrest, waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, Grace paced the narrow aisle with calculated precision, her heels clicking softly against the carpet. She could feel the weight of scrutiny on her, not just from Aria, but from the other first-class passengers. The reprimand from Jonathan Hay still echoed in her ears, gnawing at her confidence. Her job, her reputation, everything was on the line. But instead of humility, a quiet resentment burned in her chest. Why should a spoiled little girl get special treatment just because of who her father is? She thought bitterly. The chime of a call button snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned to see Aria's small hand hovering uncertainly over the button, her dark eyes full of hesitation. Grace inhaled sharply and approached, pasting on a thin smile. "Yes, Miss Aria." Aria swallowed nervously. "Can I please have some water?" Grace's smile tightened. "Of course," she said through gritted teeth, pivoting toward the galley. It was such a simple request, yet Grace's irritation flared as she poured the water into a crystal glass. She returned to Aria's seat, setting the glass down with just a little too much force. A small splash of water spilled over the rim onto Aria's dress. Aria's eyes widened, and she quickly reached for a napkin, dabbing at the spot. "I'm sorry," she whispered, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. Grace didn't bother to hide the exasperation in her voice. "Try to be more careful next time," she said, turning away before Aria could respond. The quiet hum of the cabin suddenly felt louder. Passengers exchanged glances, and Mrs. Lancaster's frown deepened. And then, Aria did something she had been trying to avoid for the entire flight. She pressed the call button again. Grace's spine stiffened at the soft ding, and she turned slowly, her expression barely concealing her frustration. Marching back to Aria's seat, she crossed her arms. "Yes, Miss Aria?" she asked, her voice laced with impatience. Aria looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Can I have another napkin, please?" she asked in a small voice. Something inside Grace snapped. "This isn't a playground, young lady," she hissed under her breath, leaning down so only Aria could hear. "You're in first class, and I expect you to act like it." Aria shrank back into her seat, her bottom lip trembling slightly. Mrs. Lancaster, who had been quietly observing, had heard enough. She pressed her own call button, her sharp eyes locking onto Grace with an authority that made the flight attendant falter. "Miss Grace," Mrs. Lancaster said coolly, "I believe we need to have a word." Grace straightened, her face flushing. "Of course, Mrs. Lancaster. How can I assist you?" The older woman tilted her head slightly, the corners of her lips curling in an almost imperceptible smile. "Assistance? No, I don't believe you've been offering much of that today. In fact, your attitude towards this young lady has been quite disappointing." Grace opened her mouth to protest, but Mrs. Lancaster continued, her voice unwavering. "I would expect a professional of your tenure to understand the value of kindness, especially when dealing with children. And yet you've shown nothing but impatience and disdain." The hush that fell over the cabin was deafening. Grace's face burned with embarrassment, and Aria's eyes widened in surprise. I apologize if I've given that impression," Grace stammered. Mrs. Lancaster leaned back, satisfied. "Apologies should be reflected in actions, not words, my dear." With a curt nod, the older woman turned her attention back to her book, effectively dismissing Grace. In the economy section, Jonathan had been engaged in a brief conversation with an investor when he noticed Emily, the kind flight attendant from earlier, heading toward him with a concerned expression. He excused himself and met her halfway. "Is Aria okay?" he asked, his sharp instincts immediately kicking in. Emily hesitated before responding. "Mr. Hay, I think you might want to check on her. I don't want to overstep, but I believe the service she's receiving isn't what you'd expect." Jonathan's jaw tightened, and without another word, he strode toward first class. The moment he entered, he could feel the tension hanging in the air. Aria sat stiffly in her seat, her eyes downcast, while Grace stood a few feet away, flustered and avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Lancaster, on the other hand, looked up and met his gaze with a knowing nod. Jonathan moved to Aria's side, crouching down so he was at eye level. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Aria hesitated, glancing at Grace before whispering, "I think I made Miss Grace mad." Jonathan's eyes darkened slightly, but his voice remained gentle. "You didn't do anything wrong, Patty." He turned his attention to Grace, his calm but commanding presence filling the space. "Miss Grace, I'd like to have a word with you." Grace swallowed hard, nodding. "Of course, Mr. Hay." Jonathan rose to his full height, his imposing figure casting a shadow over her. "Let's step aside," he said, leading her toward the galley. The moment they were alone, Jonathan's demeanor shifted from calm to authoritative. "Miss Grace," he began, his voice low but firm, "I built Orion Airways on the principles of respect and excellence, and what I've witnessed today falls far below our standards." Grace's face paled. "Mr. Hay, I didn't mean any harm. It's just, I was overwhelmed." Jonathan shook his head. "There is no excuse for making a child feel unwelcome, especially my daughter." His tone softened slightly. "Do you understand the position you've put yourself in?" Grace swallowed the lump in her throat, nodding. "Yes, sir." Jonathan studied her for a moment before continuing. "We'll discuss this further once we land. For now, I expect nothing but professionalism and kindness for the remainder of this flight." "Yes, Mr. Hay," Grace murmured, chastened. Jonathan returned to Aria's side, giving her a reassuring smile. "Everything's okay now." Aria nodded, leaning against him, finally feeling safe. And as the flight continued, Grace, now under watchful eyes, performed her duties with a newfound humility. But it was too late. Her actions had left an impression that would not be easily erased. The reckoning and redemption. The final hours of the flight passed in tense silence. Despite Jonathan's calm reassurance, Aria remained unusually quiet, curling up in her seat with the well-worn pages of her coloring book. The rhythmic hum of the engines did little to ease the lingering discomfort in her chest. She stole cautious glances at Grace, who moved about the cabin with forced precision, her previously confident strides now stiff and uncertain. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Jonathan watched his daughter closely from his seat in the economy section, his mind racing with thoughts. He had spent years building Orion Airways into a world-class airline known for its customer service and employee integrity. It was a hard-earned reputation, one he was not about to let crumble because of a single employee's lapse in judgment. Across the aisle, Mrs. Lancaster studied Jonathan's expression with a knowing smile. When the cabin crew announced their descent, she caught his eye and gave him a small nod. A silent acknowledgement of what had transpired and an unspoken promise that she, too, would have something to say once they landed. As the plane touched down smoothly at the bustling Skyline International Airport, Aria perked up slightly at the familiar sights outside the window. "Daddy, we're home," she whispered, forcing a small smile. Jonathan smiled back and kissed her forehead. "We are, sweetheart." But in his heart, he knew there was still unfinished business to attend to. Landing and consequences. The first-class passengers disembarked first, Aria holding tightly to her father's hand as they stepped onto the jet bridge. Jonathan's face was unreadable, his mind carefully calculating his next steps. Grace stood near the exit, her hands clasped nervously in front of her, her usual air of authority replaced with a subdued humility. As Jonathan passed, he didn't say a word, but his piercing gaze met hers for a brief moment, enough to send an undeniable message. Grace swallowed hard and lowered her eyes. Once they were inside the terminal, Jonathan guided Aria toward the VIP lounge, where his personal assistant, Michael Carter, was already waiting. Michael, a tall, impeccably dressed man with a knack for handling crises, immediately noticed Jonathan's expression and sprang into action. "Mr. Hay," Michael greeted, glancing down at Aria with a warm smile. "Welcome back. Shall I arrange a car to take you home?" Jonathan nodded but didn't move. "Michael," he said in a low voice, "I need you to pull the personnel file on a flight attendant, Grace Lancaster." Michael's eyes flickered with understanding. "Right away, sir." Without another word, he pulled out his tablet and began typing. Aria tugged at Jonathan's sleeve. "Daddy, am I in trouble?" Jonathan knelt beside her and cupped her cheek gently. "No, sweetheart. You did everything right." His eyes softened. "It's my job to make sure you're treated the way you deserve." Aria's lips quirked into a small smile, and Jonathan felt a renewed determination. He stood and turned back to Michael. "Have the report ready in an hour. I want a meeting with HR and Grace before the day is over." "Yes, sir." The confrontation. Later that afternoon, Grace found herself sitting anxiously in a sleek conference room inside Orion Airways corporate headquarters. She had barely had time to change out of her uniform, and her hands fidgeted in her lap. The flight home had been a harsh wake-up call. Her stomach churned with the knowledge that she had not only mistreated a passenger but the CEO's own daughter. The door opened, and Jonathan entered with Michael close behind. Grace shot to her feet, her face pale. "Mr. Hay, I—" Jonathan held up a hand, his expression unreadable. "Please, have a seat." Grace sank back into the chair, swallowing nervously. Michael sat across from her, tablet in hand, while Jonathan leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "I've reviewed your personnel file," Jonathan began, his voice measured. "You've been with Orion Airways for 6 years, promoted to first-class service 2 years ago. Stellar performance reviews, until now." Grace flinched but remained silent. Jonathan's gaze hardened. "Let me be clear, Miss Grace. This airline is built on respect and excellence, and what I witnessed today was neither." He leaned forward slightly. "Would you care to explain yourself?" Grace's mouth opened and closed, struggling to find the right words. I don't know what to say, Mr. Hay. I didn't mean to." Jonathan cut her off. "Intentions don't excuse actions." He let his words sink in before continuing. "I understand that we all have off days, but treating any passenger, let alone a child, with impatience and condescension is unacceptable." Grace looked down, shame flushing her face. "I realize that now, sir." Jonathan studied her for a long moment before signing. "I'm not here to destroy your career, Grace, but I need to know, do you understand why this behavior cannot be tolerated?" Grace nodded quickly. "Yes, Mr. Hay. I was overwhelmed, but that's no excuse. I let my frustration cloud my judgment." She looked up, eyes earnest. "I'd like the chance to make things right." Jonathan considered her carefully. "Making things right starts with accountability," he said. "Effective immediately, you'll be reassigned to economy-class service for a probationary period. You will undergo customer service retraining, and I expect to see a sincere improvement." Grace exhaled in relief, nodding vigorously. "Thank you, Mr. Hay. I won't let you down." Jonathan gave a slight nod, signaling the meeting was over. "I hope not." As Grace left the room, Michael turned to Jonathan with a raised eyebrow. "That was generous." Jonathan sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow, Michael. But I'll be watching." Michael smirked. "I have no doubt. Closure and new beginnings." Later that evening, Jonathan sat on the couch at home, Aria curled up beside him, watching her favorite cartoon. The tension of the day had finally eased, and the warm glow of their living room felt like a sanctuary. "Daddy?" Aria's voice was soft. "Yes, sweetheart." Miss Grace looked really sad today. She twirled a curl of her hair thoughtfully. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Jonathan smiled gently. "I think so, baby. Sometimes people make mistakes, but what's important is that they learn from them." Aria nodded, snuggling closer. "You always say it's good to be kind, even when people aren't kind to us." Jonathan kissed the top of her head, pride swelling in his chest. "That's right. And you were very brave today." Aria giggled. "I think I'll always sit next to you from now on." Jonathan chuckled, wrapping his arms around her. "I'd like that." As they sat together, Jonathan felt a sense of contentment settle over him. The journey had been turbulent, but he had done what he always strived to do: stand up for what was right, with dignity and grace. And with that thought, he knew that no matter how many flights they took, Aria would always know she belonged. A lesson in grace and growth. The days following the flight were a whirlwind of reflection and growth for everyone involved. Aria, despite her young age, had an innate sense of forgiveness and empathy. She had asked her father if Grace would be okay more than once, a testament to the kindness she carried in her heart. Jonathan, on the other hand, balanced the need for accountability with his belief that people could change if given the right opportunity. Meanwhile, Grace embarked on a humbling journey of self-improvement. The reassignment to economy class was a stark contrast to the luxuries of first class, but it served as a reminder of why she had chosen this career in the first place. She learned to see passengers not just as seat numbers, but as individuals with stories, families, and emotions. She worked alongside a more diverse group of travelers and colleagues, slowly mending her perspective and attitude. An unexpected reunion. 2 months later, Aria and Jonathan found themselves at Ocean View International Airport once again. This time, it wasn't for a business trip, but rather a well-deserved vacation to the Caribbean. Aria, dressed in a bright blue dress, bounced with excitement as they made their way through the terminal. "Daddy, do you think we'll see Miss Grace again?" she asked, her eyes scanning the bustling crowd. Jonathan smiled softly. "I don't know, sweetheart, but if we do, I'm sure she'll be happy to see you." As they approached the check-in counter, a familiar face greeted them. Emily, the kind flight attendant who had supported Aria during their last flight, beamed as she recognized them. "Well, well, look who's back," she said warmly, leaning down to Aria's level. "Excited for another adventure?" Aria giggled and nodded enthusiastically. "I'm going to build the biggest sandcastle ever." Jonathan chuckled, shaking Emily's hand. "It's good to see you again." Emily handed them their boarding passes and leaned in slightly. "You might be in for a surprise, Mr. Hay," she said with a twinkle in her eye. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, but didn't have time to ask further before Aria tugged him excitedly toward the security line. Once they were seated in the first-class cabin, Aria looked around curiously. "I wonder who our flight attendant will be this time," she mused. Just then, a familiar voice chimed in from the aisle. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hay, Miss Aria." Jonathan turned to see Grace standing there, dressed in her crisp uniform, but something about her had changed. The nervous energy she once carried was replaced with a quiet confidence, and her smile, this time, was genuine. Aria's face lit up in surprise. "Miss Grace, you're back." Grace knelt beside Aria's seat and nodded. "Yes, I am. And I owe you an apology, young lady." She glanced at Jonathan before continuing, her voice sincere. I wasn't very kind to you last time, and I want you to know that I've been working really hard to be better. Aria tilted her head thoughtfully. Are you being nice to all the kids now? Grace chuckled softly. I sure am. And to all the grown-ups too. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded paper crane. I made this for you. A little something to say thank you for teaching me an important lesson. Aria's eyes sparkled as she took the delicate crane in her hands. Wow, it's so pretty. Thank you, Miss Grace. Jonathan watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, offering Grace a nod of approval. It's good to see you again, Grace, he said. Grace straightened and smiled. Thank you for giving me another chance, Mr. Hay. I won't waste it. As the flight progressed, Grace's service was impeccable, filled with warmth and attentiveness. Aria, now feeling more comfortable, chatted happily with Grace about her vacation plans, and Jonathan observed with a sense of peace. When the plane landed, Aria turned to her father and whispered, Miss Grace is much better now, isn't she? Jonathan smiled. Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes, people just need a little reminder of what really matters. Final reflections. As they stepped off the plane and into the warm Caribbean air, Jonathan couldn't help but reflect on the journey, not just the physical one, but the emotional and moral one they had all taken. He had always believed in fairness, in giving people the opportunity to grow from their mistakes, and Grace had proven that with the right support and humility, change was possible. Aria skipped ahead, holding her paper crane carefully, her innocent heart already full of forgiveness and joy. Jonathan watched her and felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons learned through his daughter's eyes. Lessons of patience, empathy, and second chances. In the end, it wasn't just about flying from one destination to another. It was about the journey of growth and understanding that happened in between. And as Jonathan held Aria's hand and walked into their vacation, he knew that this journey, both for himself and for Grace, was only just beginning.